All right. So we are live with Mercedes Juarez. She is in Mexico City doing some great work with the Bitcoin community. I'm your host, Craig LeBlanc, the Doorman. I do a podcast with the Bitcoin Daily Show. And then this is something that I wanted to do to highlight people that I've met on that series. And she came on our Women in Bitcoin. But I think I'm trying to think where we found each other, but the work you're doing was just amazing. And as I
Thank
got
you.
cranked up here, figuring out the technology of how to do um, video and then creating a YouTube channel for it, you were one of the people I was absolutely wanting to keep up with so that we could share what you're doing with the rest of the world as much as possible. Because I think the work you're doing is just so important and just needs to get the word out more. So anything I can do to ever help you raise awareness to the work you're doing, please reach out to me on a
Thank you,
regular
Craig. Thank you.
basis
Thank you very much. Yes.
to share your message with everyone. So, Ed, how are you doing today?
Hello?
Oh, can you hear me now
Yes?
still?
Yeah, I can
Okay.
hear you now. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your history, where you came from and how you got started, where you're at.
Okay,
Oh,
great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation. I think it's an opportunity for me to share the exciting experience we are going through here in Yucatan, is the southern part of Mexico, where the Maya culture evolved. I am originally from Mexico. I was born in Mexico City, and I'm going to give you some perspective because I'm 75 years old. So that's some generations that I have gone through in the Latin American context. I was born there to a mother that was at that time 15 years old. And she was coming from the rural areas uh, near where Zapata was born. Emiliano Zapata, you must have heard the name, is related to our Mexican Revolution. And my grandmother was a very poor indigenous woman. This woman was displaced from an original town near to, I would say, closer to the civilization that where Sor Juana Inés was born. Sor Juana Inés is a female character for us that it's a nun originally, but very well educated. And she put across lots of messages like something, I don't know if I'm translated okay, but saying men who blame women for the way they are, and yet they are forced to be that way by the way men treat them. So I grew up in that region where a revolution had taken place. My grandmother, being an indigenous woman who hardly spoke Spanish, uh, went to live in the outskirts of the volcano that is called Popocatépetl. In short-term way, we call it the Popo volcano. That still is giving a lot of trouble because it's very active. So I sometimes was growing up in this very poor, rural, marginal town that it doesn't qualify at all as even as a village. At least at the time I was living there, we were still bartering. My grandmother used to go and exchange, for instance, eggs for some chalk that she needed to prepare her tortillas, or money was not important at that time because they didn't know it. So I grew up in this context. And then sometimes I was taken to Mexico City, living in the slums, because my mother was working very hard to earn her living. So my bringing up is between the rural and urban poorest slums. Why I say this? Because in Mexico is a highly stratified society, as most of Latin American countries, with a sharp contrast between the elite group and the poorest groups of the population. So, having been exposed to the rural women and to the urban slums, female vulnerable population, I was since very little thinking, how can I help? That was my question, so that you understand how my life was guided. And because I saw these very vulnerable women, always to the mercy of the economic situation. There were hardly men, because in the Latin American societies, until nowadays, men abandon women. They are very free and they are mobile, and women remain in the place where they are pregnant. So that made a very sharp difference between the opportunities that men and women have in our societies. Well, once I was in Mexico City, after I started school, I was more permanent in the urban society because I had to attend school, and where my grandmother was living, there were no school. So the way I went through, I started to go with grown up. At that time in Mexico, we had schools for the adults. It was at night. So my first 3 years of primary school, I attended with adults. So for me, it was very intimidating because it was like I didn't have children to interact with. And these adults were working class, very aggressive, and most of them men. So I had to find my way through to uh, speak in the class, to do the homework, and so on. But I had a very positive experience because during the day, my mother used to buy the waste of a biscuits factory, a Mexican biscuit factory, so that I could sell this waste in little kind of bags that I prepare myself. And when I was selling these biscuits, the children came out of the school to buy. I was out of one of the primary schools in these poor slums. And I saw that these children came out so happy because they were shouting and laughing. And so I thought, must be something wonderful inside that school because they come out so happy. So I couldn't make the association that they were happy because they were leaving the school. So my dream was to go to school during the day. So eventually I managed, and I managed to finish primary school. I managed to finish secondary school. This is a major undertaking here if you are in the lowest part of the society, because, for instance, secondary school, I had to enroll myself because my mother didn't know how to. My mother was an illiterate woman, so very soon as I started the schooling system, I became her mother because I was the one who was able to decode the culture, and especially to take a bus, what the bus was saying at the front, where is it going. So my mother couldn't decode all that. So very soon I had to be a grown up to merge with the adult demands in the poorest areas of Mexico City. But once I was able to overcome this schooling system, I was able to understand some of the cultural codes that you have to overcome to filter this schooling system. Because just to give you some background,
How
in the
old
Mexican, well, you finish school in Mexico City, you start at 6 years old, and you finish primary school 12 years old. And then you have secondary school 3 years, and the equivalent to your high school, it's another 3 years. So I
uh,
was 12 when I finished the primary school and started secondary school. And at that time, well, I had to figure out how to survive more and more among different social groups, because the system in the Latin American societies is that you go through schooling, especially primary school. In Mexico is, for instance, compulsory and is supposed to be free. So in theory, everyone can access primary school, even secondary school. But there is another dimension that I don't know if you. Sometimes I'm going to introduce some of my reference in the theoretical background. So there is this French sociologist. It's called Pierre Bourdieu, and Pierre Bourdieu was part of this Marxist approach philosophers that decided to analyze education. And he thought that there was not only financial capital, but also cultural capital. And the cultural capital was another form of economic uh, capital because it enabled the cultural capital. What I'm trying to say is when you go to school, you enter as equal, but the outcome is not the same because maybe at home you don't have a tape recorder. Nowadays, the children of the poorest villages in Mexico, they don't have access to computers at all, but they might have once in a while use some cellular phone from their parents or from their neighbors. So it's kind of erratic how you access this cultural capital, but it's kind of a second nature for the middle and upper class because their parents know to start with how to speak Spanish in our societies. So I didn't speak proper Spanish because my mother was illiterate, was coming from an indigenous background, spoke in another uh, uh, language. We call it dialects, but in fact are languages. And for those of you who are not familiar with Mexican society, we have over 68 different ethnic groups, and most of them have their own language, which means a wide variety. My mother used to speak Nahuatl. You know a lot of Nahuatl being Mexicans because chocolate, for instance, is chocolatl, comes from Nahuatl, or avocado is also a Nahuatl word. Many words are Nahuatl that are now part of the international vocabulary, but that's the original language. So it's an entirely different language to Spanish, which means that the cultural capital that you acquire is not the same if you are an indigenous person or a poorest person to the middle and upper class person. And having said that, for instance, for those of you who are familiar with El Salvador, some countries like El Salvador, that is valid for most of Central American countries, they eradicated the indigenous population, so they don't have the richness that we have culturally speaking, because it's more homogeneous society. The Western came and there were no indigenous culture. And so it's more like the Western culture that is prevailing. In the Mexican society, if you go to smaller villages, if you come here to Yucatan, that you are the most welcome, here you'll find very alive the Maya culture. And it's even the opposite sometimes, like the dominant Spanish has incorporated some Mayan terms that are used by even by the upper class, because it's so normal to use some words, that Mayan words, in our daily communication. So this is a background because cultural capital is very important for you to succeed, and it's part of the financial capital. It enables you to also to access the economic power that is dominant. For instance, unbanked population uh, are banked because they cannot decode the banking system. And the
How,
same is true. Sorry, Craig, yes?
how do you maybe can you describe cultural capital? Because actually, you were the first person that I've ever heard use that term, and I really liked your angle on it. But maybe for someone who's never heard that, and how do we use cultural capital?
Oh, yeah. Well, the cultural capital in this sociologist terms, Bourdieu, he thought is kind of the habits that you acquire. In fact, he has this term habit that you acquire through your social class that become kind of second nature. For instance, all the ways you respond, how you dress, how you talk, how you behave, for instance, while eating. For instance, in the French culture, if you are in the rural villages, you might use the fork and the spoon and the knife, but you don't have the refinement of the upper French class that might have 3 or 4 or 5 forks for different purposes. And when you are at the table, if you are still nowadays, if you are invited to this very elegant, or like the English have the high table, you might have more than three. In the cutlery is very sophisticated. You have to select the one that is used for specific purposes. I think for those of you who haven't seen Pretty Woman, it's very well depicted when she goes to a very elegant restaurant and then she has to eat with one of the spoons, and then all of a sudden the food is just running into the space because she doesn't know how to use that specific uh, item within the cutlery. The same is true for the glasses, for instance, a white one, for instance, a white wine glass, or if you are drinking red wine, it's a different type of glass. If you are drinking only water. So when you are able to decode all these different glasses, all these difference in the variety of items in the cutlery, it's second nature for you. You don't even think. But if you are a poor person coming from another reference, you are not that familiar with all these varieties and these options that you have because you have never used them, are not part of your reference. In the school system, this is very important, particularly in Latin American societies, because the contrast is very sharp. Nowadays, the elite is mainly educated in the what the English call the public schools, that is actually private schools. We have the elite educated in different places, but they might are forced to give a grant for poor children. Those poor children usually have a very tough time because they are not familiar with all the behavior of this middle and upper class. In the poorest areas, what happens is the children have different cultural capitals. With, for instance, inflation nowadays, the middle class is more and more coming into the what we call public or government schools, and that are supposed to be free, but that's not the case because you have to pay different things that the poorest families don't have. For instance, you have to buy sometimes books that are extra curriculum, and although the state gives you free the books because it's supposed to be free primary education, first of all, the books are programmed according with the ideology of the state. You might don't want to train your children in this ideology, but that's the only option you are given if you are poor. Then the second thing is you might need some of the other books that some of the middle and upper class children have in their homes, or they have heard literature, they have heard poetry, they have heard music, they have heard a lot of things that the school will value without having taught it, which is important because apparently all the children have the same opportunity in school, but they won't have the same opportunity when being tested. The result will be completely different. And those children that come from more marginalized families less with their peers that have more options. Nowadays, with technology in Mexico, this is very important because now we see the contrast with the children in the upper class. They go to schools that, like Western northern countries, you don't need, for instance, to have access to books because you have your iPad, and that's more than enough for you to access all kind of information. But the children in primary school, for instance, here where I live in these rural villages, well, they continue to use the textbook that the government provides, still with very poor Marxist and woke ideology, which is the worst, but still they are exposing only to that ideology. They don't have the chance to access all their types of information, despite that information in our present days is accessible as never has been in history. But it's kind of, we are living different historic ages in the same time or at the same time because we have different cultural capitals. And of course, we have different opportunities to access all the technological means. Technology in these societies like Latin America is not distributed equally. Well, the same is true for other northern countries like United States. I mean, it's what I'm trying to emphasize, economic capital is not the only one. And in my case, I was able to overcome this cultural capital. I was able to decode, and I have to break through until arriving to the university. And then there is another story. So if you can ask me
Well,
this, you let
sure.
me know.
So, do you think, sometimes we think our cultural capital can get lost when we're entering this global stage.
Yeah.
We have, it's almost like everybody can talk to everybody. But in a way, now lesser known cultures now have a platform to be able to speak and be exposed to the world. Have you seen maybe I don't know if you want to call it a new renaissance, but I've noticed how I've experienced a lot more cultures on X in Twitter, just because now I have people from like South Africa and England and
Yeah,
Ireland,
yeah.
Mexico City, and El Salvador on my show that I would have no exposure to being in Louisiana. And now I have somewhat of an appreciation and an understanding of the different types of cultures out there, because now it's almost like the whole planet's talking to each other. So I wanted to see what your take was on that.
Well, you're right, Craig, because globalization, that's what we are living, this phenomenon, is aided by the technological development. And it's true, in a globalized world, we're more and more exposed. But it's we, the ones who have access, we have a different cultural capital to the most vulnerable population in most Latin American societies. Because that's what I was trying to explain. They don't have that easy access as we do to technology because there are economic limitations. But on top of that, they don't have the cultural capital to be able to benefit from that access to information. What I'm saying, what as middle class have, is like the vice president chosen by Trump. I mean, he's one example, a bit like I am. Like you come from these very poorest, marginal societies, and if you manage to break through and you arrive to the university, then you understand this. All the people you interview, for instance, have access to some education to be able to decode this dominant culture. But there is the subjugated culture, the dominated culture. That is a different story altogether. Is it something that can you recognize?
Yes, absolutely, I can. It's and it is different because even though I do get a lot of exposure to different cultures, like you said, the marginalized have a more difficult time. But I have been able to speak to a lot of people in Nigeria and a couple other very poor um, African nations that I feel
Yeah.
like are just now being able to come online and share their voice, their experiences with the rest of the world. And it really is eye opening because, especially with Bitcoin, for Bitcoin, it's kind of a store of value. We're trying to store our wealth. But for those countries that are unbanked, this is the only money they have to transact with. And so
Exactly.
for
Yeah.
them, it's a totally different use case. And we don't really see that much here in America because our means of exchange is very robust and everywhere. Whereas over there, they just can't get a hold of money to do business with and exchange among themselves. So different meaning for different cultures and different kind of different levels of
Well,
poverty.
that exactly, that's the crucial part. It's different meanings for different purposes and different social groups, and that's what I would like later. Later in our conversation, to talk about what is for me the Bitcoin community, because the Bitcoin community are sometimes not aware about these subtleties. To give you a background, to finish my background, once I went to the university, and I think one of the reasons why I was able to be so determined in getting a university degree is because I was able to decode that the schooling system was the only way I could break through my my original belonging to these social groups in poverty, and being able to help, being with some resources that only education could provide. So I finished a degree in education, and so the sciences of education, and within that I specialized in anthropology, and then I went to study some diplomas in philosophy. And once I was working in education, I realized that there was very little to do because I was all my life, I'm 75 years old. So all my life I've been working with women. And then I realized that the most vulnerable women were, of course, were very limited in terms of economic resources. But I also saw that when they were having troubles with their health, everything collapsed. So the most important crisis that I saw among these poorest of the poor was when they get ill. So then I decided that with education, it was too late because they don't have access to education. So I changed to do some education in health, how to protect their health. So I had a master's degree in social medicine, and I have another master's degree at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in London, and what we call community health and international public health. So with that, all my professional career, like around 40 years, it was mainly to see how to protect women's health, because that's the source of falling completely into poverty and never being able to regain some power to access some of the economic benefits that our society allows these poor groups to access. So my career is, I have worked over 50 countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and throughout Latin America, in some Arab countries. And also, I mean, are stratified societies, of course, because the fiat society, with this fiat economy, produces this completely different access to different groups that benefit differently economically. So at some point in my career, I was guided by the Marxist philosophy. I had to be Marxist because that was at my time and my generation, that was the only explanation to see the differences between the social classes. Why? Because it was unequal distribution of economic access. And Marx had the clarity to say, well, it's the economic foundation that gives this variety of results in terms of how you access cultural capital. And the ideology behind to remain poor or to break through in the dominant system. So I belong to different social movements like Theology of Liberation. I was working with the Jesuits in the communities. Officially, Mexico is at least 90% Catholics, but we don't practice. But in ideological, I think ideologically we are Catholics, in the sense that, particularly education of women, we believe in all the limitations of the Catholic culture, like we are sinners, we confess, and then everything is okay, and then we start to sin again. So when I was working, for instance, in Northern Europe with the Protestant culture, I realized that that was not the case, that it's a more kind of solid outstanding in the world, because you relate directly to God, and God sees you. You cannot deceive. You cannot buy from the Pope some absolution because you are a sinner. So it was kind of more coherent. And having worked in countries like Denmark or like in Holland, well, I saw that the Protestant culture was more precise and strict in social terms, because my career was always social development, because women are depending on these different theories, different philosophers. But what Marx and all the Marxist philosophers never thought was how to enable women to have equal stand to access the opportunities that men tend to have in society. Tend to have, because of course there are sharp difference between men as well. I'm not a feminist because I think it's too easy to blame men for all the problems we have. Because I think, in fact, women are very powerful, and then we have other type of powers. But I also think that the Marxist theory acknowledges the social difference. I have to go into Michel Foucault to understand the microphysics of power and how these women are able to challenge, like nowadays, unfortunately, not always in the right way, but to challenge the establishment. So women, for me, was this group or segment of the population that was marginalized, but that had the potential to question and change our society. I saw it in the spiritual side as well, like the Dalai Lama, for instance. Nowadays, the Buddhist groups or the Christian groups still are counting on women to make the changes that we badly need in society. So I saw women very powerful, but of course, objectively, they were very oppressed. Especially, I was working with the most vulnerable women in the population. So when you work in countries like Bangladesh or in India, and you see that, for instance, I was working at that time for United Nations, and you see in their offices, I made studies where only 13% were women in the establishment of the Western UN system. But that meant that these women were usually the secretaries and maybe one or two professionals, but still predominantly the ones hired were men, even for solving problems of women. I'm not saying that women are, by definition, the ones that are going to question and change the system, because some women are very well established in their benefits as a social group. And throughout Latin America, since I was tiny little, I experienced the oppression of women by other women, and it was worse than the oppression of the men sometimes, because my mother was always working as a maid in the rich houses, and these wealthy women were easily oppressing other women, sometimes in a more aggressive way than the men abused them. So being a woman is not warranted of anything. It's just what kind of woman one is, isn't it? Am I going in the right direction, Craig?
Oh yes, no, I'm loving the way you're taking this. I would like to maybe shift or move towards how did you discover Bitcoin and what it can do to everything you've just described and laid out. How do you feel like that can make a difference in women's life and the marginalized?
Yes. Yeah, well, for me, Bitcoin represents, after having told you, I was with the Jesuits and Theology Liberation, priests for people that was a very strong movement. Like if you are riding to El Salvador, for those of you who are, is the paradise of Bitcoin nowadays for us in Latin America. When you arrive at the airport, you see that it says the airport's name is Monsignor Romero. Monsignor Romero, in my generation, was killed because we have the Marxist ideology thinking the Bible is saying love is the essence, and we cannot love someone if it's dying of hunger. So, in our view, we have to question the establishment and we have to change our societies. Monsignor Romero was killed by the elite because he was protecting the peasants and the working class. In Mexico, we have other experiences, and there was a very strong movement at that time by the bishops to embrace this approach of theology of liberation. So it was Jesus who came and he talked a lot about poverty, and he wants us to commit ourselves to enable the poor people to uh, access a society that has opportunity also for them. So then after that, with Michel Foucault, that was questioning sharply the Marxist approach, I realized that, for instance, all women, we go to the market or to go shopping, but not all of us have the same purchasing power, which means that uh, there are social differences also among women. There are problems that are, I would say, transclassist, problems that are common to all women. For instance, nowadays, I worked a lot with the elite of Yucatan, and the women, to my surprise, as are oppressed, the elite women, as are the poorest women that I've been working for 40 years. Because some of the, for instance, the area of reproductive health, all the area of reproductive health issues, the freedom for women to decide on their bodies is not there, despite different social classes. But also we have some common issues, but also we have very sharp differences in terms of purchasing power. And sometimes we get it through the men. It's not our own merit. We marry a wealthy man and that's it. But we use that power, that economic power. And some women have the cultural capital. For instance, they were raised by wealthy families here in Merida. So they know all the codes. They are sent to United States to, for instance, to Ivy League sometimes. Sometimes they have degrees of the Ivy Leagues, but they become the subservient housewife for these very wealthy men locally. But they are educated women, and they know perfectly well how to use the different wine glasses, the different cutlery, and so on. So the competition for a poor woman to marry this man or a middle class woman to marry this wealthy man reduces because she doesn't have the cultural capital. She could get this economic capital through the man, but the man unconsciously will pick the woman who is able to decode his own culture. So these subtleties can be very meaningful when you work in development, as I have done it. And what I see coming to Bitcoin, for me, Bitcoin is the opportunity into history, because all these movements that I belong to in Latin America as well, we have many important philosophies like Darcy Ribeiro, who used to say, it's not what is important to arrive alone and quickly, but arrive together and on time. And we have this perspective, like Paulo Freire, we don't educate people, we learn by educating. So all these different approaches gave us a different perspective, but still we didn't have the mean, we didn't have the opportunity that Bitcoin is bringing in history to us. I have two children, a daughter and a son. And my son started to go into this Bitcoin. At the beginning, he was looking at all these cryptocurrencies. He was lost into that, but eventually he realized, no, it's Bitcoin. It's only Bitcoin. And I was surprised that he was so dedicated, so devoted to learn everything about Bitcoin. So I started to see why it was so relevant to see this opportunity in history. And thanks to him, I was able to decode information that otherwise it's impossible for my generation to grasp, because it's a highly sophisticated mathematical model. And we were analogic. Now we have to become digital. So we don't have the means as a generation, as a tendency. In my personal case, I'm even more limited. But through the help of my son, I was able to access the information of Bitcoin, to listen to Michael Saylor and all the gurus, and listen all the podcasts. And slowly I was able to grasp that again, because my concern is always women, again, women were going to be marginal to this information. So I started to think together, brainstorming with my son, how could we make a difference for indigenous women? Because we already work with communities in different ways. And we thought, okay, maybe the indigenous women need financial education, but it's not any financial education, it's digital financial education, and it's education in Bitcoin. Well, for instance, if you go and see in El Salvador, my first Bitcoin for me, it's a marvelous tool. Yet it's more for those who have cultural capital to grasp that information, and mainly will be the children who have had access to education to be able to decode what they are exposed to in terms of Bitcoin as the next way of interacting economically. Having said that, I think my first Bitcoin needs a lot of adaptation for indigenous women to be used, but I'm using it because we have the opportunity nowadays. My children's father has been there all his life, an educator, and he has created some platform that is called, I don't know how to translate it in English, but it's something like Together We Can Do It. And this means that because the state is so limited and poor, the education they give to our schooling teachers in the government system, he has created this platform where they can upgrade their education. So we are preparing this version similar to my first Bitcoin, but more adapted to our cultural needs, because this is the Mayan culture, so that we can have a training for these teachers, so that the teachers are able to expose the children to this fantastic phenomenon that is Bitcoin. So it's kind of our approach is trickle down. If we train the trainers, they will be able to train others. So until they reach the children at school in the poorest slums and the poorest villages, because we don't have the means to reach those schools. And so this is one of the projects we have. So Bitcoin for us is an opportunity to access a different way to exchange in society. And in my case, particularly, is to overcome all the limitations and all the distorted approach that we have in the fiat society. It's not only talking about unbanked women, but enable them not to have access to the Western banking system, but to have access to a different way of interacting economically. So once I grasped the most general principles of Bitcoin, because I'm not an expert in Bitcoin, I always resort to my son to see, how do you use this wallet? How do I put this Bitcoin in this place? Or how do I receive this donation, blah, blah, blah. Because I don't have the means to be operational, let's say. I need a lot of help still, Craig.
Now, in your work, what are some stories or changes you've seen with people starting to use Bitcoin as a as a new system of money versus what they had, or maybe what were some of the transitions you've seen from the system that you saw prior to Bitcoin, and then now how are you seeing it? People not just use it, but understand what money is.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much for your question. That's a very crucial question, because unfortunately, we are not yet at that level of progress. We are exposing the community to the concepts. And sometimes, for instance, even in the Maya culture, we made a video, and the women cannot even pronounce Bitcoin as such. I mean, because the Maya language, it's just to get familiar with the term. But I was telling you, our Mexican societies is kind of new money to them. The Mexican peso, not to talk about the dollar, it's alien to them because they were bartering. It's very recent that we're exposed to this concept of money as we know in the Western societies, as we know it. And even in the pre-Hispanic culture, there was a way to exchange. And there is even a coin that until nowadays was, some groups were trying to introduce it into the indigenous communities, but the government came with all the force and said it was illegal. And when it has been in our pre-Hispanic history, in our all the previous history, but of course the dominance of the Mexican economy nowadays is the peso, and they impose it. We were surprised legally. So you can be taken to court as a poor peasant for using that coin that has been there forever in our culture. So having said that, I think what the poor people grasp and the indigenous community grasp very easily is the key concepts of economy. For instance, they don't understand inflation as such. The word is sometimes alien to them. As a concept, they do understand, even if they don't know the word. They are very clear that every month, every year, they go to buy 1 kilo of tortillas, 1 kilo of beans. The price has changed and it's increasing and increasing. And the money they are paid, in theory, like this mockery of president that we had, it increases the salary constantly. But it's devaluating the money constantly. So they are aware that the money is insufficient. Even if they are increased their basic salary, they cannot afford to follow the increase of price in the economy. Another thing they are very clear is that not all of them have salaries. How they are going to overcome this? Those who have salaries, maybe they can aim to make this salary last enough to buy the basic things they need to survive. But the ones who are not working, they don't have a salary. How do they survive? And most of these rural communities, they were harvesting their own food and they were planting their own food. So nowadays, of course, we are in the same phenomenon that United States and all these big multinationals of the industry of food have imposed on us. That is all this processed food, the junk food. and they are unfortunately now consuming those. The Mexican diet has been almost destroyed, the indigenous diet, because being poor in my generation didn't mean to be, for instance, um, worse in terms of health, because we, until recently, we were eating even better than the middle of upper class. Why? Because we were not having money to use pesticides or fertilizers. We were cutting on the spot the fruit that we needed, the plant that we needed to eat. So it was fresher, it was healthier. So, but nowadays, if you see the statistics for this state where I'm living in, Yucatan, Yucatan is the #1 consumption of Coca-Cola in the country. And I don't know if you're aware, Mexico consumes nowadays more Coke than United States. And you see here indigenous women that give to their 2-year-old children the Coke as a first need for the child. So this has resulted, my field is health, so this has resulted in diabetes being #1 in the country and obesity being #1 in the country. So all these subtleties, and I am very happy to see how the Bitcoin community more and more is so concerned with health, because that's the #1 issue. And I think the government and the multinationals nowadays are targeting our health. We saw it with the pandemic. So it's health is targeted now. And then we need really to, more than ever, to inform the people about what it implies to be healthy. And for me, the challenge is how to let know women what is positive or negative in terms of adopting in their families for the nutrition of their children. And because nowadays, for instance, the scarcity #1 here and throughout Mexico is water. So if they don't have water for drinking, they won't have water for irrigation, which means they stop planting the little family kind of backyard they have for having some plants that were very nutritional for them. There is a local plant that exists also in El Salvador, for instance, it's called chaya, and it's richer than the spinach, for instance, in terms of iron intake and so on. So this is being lost. And for me, the challenge of how to I bring Bitcoin in the community, and not only as an economic tool, but it's more as grasping a different concept, how we can exchange differently, and maybe in our case, rescue what it was already there in our culture, in the pre-Hispanic culture, which means that before Western culture came to dominate the indigenous cultures, it was there. They were very wise. They of course, they didn't know plastic. Our environment was clean. Nowadays, everything is polluted. Plastic is all over the places. And the indigenous communities were not prepared to this development that we have nowadays. So for me, when I go into the community, in this Freirean approach, I see, well, what am I learning from them? I'll tell you, it's beyond your question, because I think I described how I was exposed to Bitcoin, but now I am reaching the phase how to bring these circular economies into Bitcoin. And in our case, we think it's not enough just to give some Bitcoin in some community like they are doing in Peru, for instance. But this NGO, to me, is not correct in terms of development, because you are introducing some Satoshis and you're giving them to pay the teacher, and then the teacher is going to get used to get this Bitcoin through being paid. But once the person who is paying this teacher, the teacher won't willingly educate these children. And the whole collapse, because it's infiltrated from outside. It's an artificial motivation. And the community has to empower themselves and use their own resources in order to access this next economic opportunity that we have in Bitcoin. So what we are doing is working with indigenous communities where already we had to be strategic, because what is in the community is not always good, it's not always usable. Our communities have been drinking alcohol for generations. So some of them They have very poor designs. They are not productive. So we don't mystify the community. So then we go to spots like we have in Yucatan, in the southern part. We have some priests, Catholic priests, that have been working with communities. They were expelled from their church because the bishop that was very conservative, still they are very conservative, is the most backwards Catholic church here in Yucatan. They were expelled from their church because they said, no, the priest is not there to teach the peasants how to grow plants. They are there for preaching. And these priests were expelled from their churches, and they created an agricultural rural school for peasants to train them in their traditional practices that they lost. They don't know anymore how the Maya culture used to harvest, grow, take use of the rain, how they use the cycle of the moon. So they have to rescue back all this knowledge, and they are training the newer generations in their own traditions. And their main concern is not that they are productive to sell what they produce, but to feed their family, for the family to remain healthy. And this has been going on for 40 years. So we're tapping on their education and accessing these groups to train them on Bitcoin, because they are more advanced in terms of being aware of pesticides, being aware of what fertilizers are dangerous, in terms of how the honey, we have a local bee, as in United States, we have many local bees. There is not even the dominant bee in the market. They produce honey, but they are they were about being extinct because it's so aggressive, the use of pesticides in this state. So nowadays they are aware that they shouldn't use at all chemicals because that can kill this local bee. We call it melipona. And the Mayas used this honey not only for eating, mainly for healing purposes, for the eyes, for different purposes. And it's supposed to, as the other honey as well, to boost your immune system. But this is, in this case, it's very specific and it's very scarce. So it's more expensive than the other. And my son used the parallel of this melipona honey with Bitcoin, and says, well, Bitcoin is scarce, is limited. So we try to use what is known to them to make parallels. So if you use my first Bitcoin, they won't understand anything. But if you make a parallel, like the way you produce honey is the same strategy that Bitcoin is using, because we cannot print money. They don't know of course, they don't know the Federal Reserve in the United States, but they do understand that the printing of money is devaluating the currency. And that's what we are trying to grasp, what is familiar to their culture. Like, for instance, beans, we have a traditional saying, if you add water to the beans, then you can include more people to eat. So we add more water to the beans, so we eat less beans. But they are familiar with these concepts. If you translate it to economic jargon, they can grasp that. But it's a whole process in itself. Do I give you an idea of what it implies?
Yes, and what I also love about it is it's, it seems like when you have fiat in your system, that it allows theft of, across the planet. So when you're using something it's a very tool of theft, then you can extract wealth and value from anywhere in the world. And so I feel bad for a lot of cultures and countries like yours that are using this mechanism of theft. So they create this value only to have it devalued and shipped clear across the planet. Whereas at least with Bitcoin, when you create the value can stay there in that country. And it allows you to try to keep more of the value locally, which I think works great with these circular economies that you spoke about trying to build. So if somebody wanted to get involved, and I only have about 5 more minutes, so how can
Okay.
how can somebody find more of your work, or how can somebody get?
Well, you are welcome to come here. We are trying, I don't know, we are trying to create, in a nutshell, we think circular economy should be given the opportunity to these groups to access the real economy. So We have a house now in the center of Merida where the economic dynamic really takes place. The tourists come to Merida, is the capital of Yucatan. And then we will give access to them to sell very good quality of garments and what they produce so that the Bitcoiners can support them and buy their items because are good quality, not only because they are poor, because that's a patronizing attitude. We think we have to excel in what we offer as well. And in this house, my son is opening a Bitcoin house. It's a Casa Bitcoin is called. And there we will gather all the people that are foreigners that are coming to Yucatan, and mainly they go to Merida. They will access that house. Is in the center of the main square almost. Is in the center of the city. And then we will have also activities for Bitcoiners and expose these indigenous groups also to these Bitcoiners and to what is this real economy, not only the conceptual side, but so we think when they are paid in Bitcoin, then it's a different story altogether. They will be inclined to know what it is about. And maybe it's not only important to give them conceptually what is Bitcoin, but the practice of Bitcoin, being able to sell their commodities in Bitcoin and being paid in Bitcoin. But the most important project, we work in the communities, we work with this house where they will sell their things. This Casa Bitcoin will be open at the end of this year in Merida. And as crucial of these two, the bridge is, I would call it kind of a citadel, although strictly it's not a citadel. Together with Jim in Baja, well, I think Mexico is going through a very exciting process. We've been, I mean, when Jim came here to visit my son, they are always kind of brainstorming how to make it better, this citadel. We have a citadel together now with some Dutch families, and we are creating a ranch. We need that sovereignty has to be translated into practice, into self-sustainability. So now we are planting local plants, and we have local cattle, and we are building very basic minimalistic houses, eco-friendly houses. And there we are planting what we are going to sell with the communities in this Casa Bitcoin in the center. Well, this is the way we bridge with the community, because we don't think as Bitcoiners we need to isolate and protect ourselves and have guns to protect ourselves. That is one dimension. And I remember you said you give as birthday presents to children sometimes some arm to protect themselves and to learn. I think fantastic that the children learn to use an arm. But in our case, we think the most important thing is to bridge with the community existing already there, which we are doing that. So it's the same community that is helping us to build the ranch, to plant the things, and we are in exchange supporting their access to Bitcoin, supporting their development, their progress in what they are doing, informing them of the opportunities that technology brings to us. So Bitcoin for us is a whole dimension in life. It's not a coin, it's not what replaces only money. It replaces cultural capital. It's a different cultural capital. It's not the fiat capital. And when the writer of Bitcoin Standard said the industry of misery, and that's development, unfortunately, is true. In my generation, there was this guy who wrote a book on Lords of Poverty. So we have to be careful, especially the Bitcoiners had this tendency, which is very beautiful because they want to make the world better. But to make the world better, you have to be very cautious. You have to study and be careful, because you might end up supporting an NGO that is making money out of the poor people, or that is taking superficially the development. And in the long term, it won't be any help, because the artificial motivation that you introduce to a community disappears, there's nothing to sustain that intervention. So I think the Bitcoiners need to learn more about the complexity of being or wanting or being able to enable other people to access Bitcoin and to leave poverty and to really embrace this wonderful opportunity that we are given by Bitcoin. Bitcoin, when I listen to Michael Saylor, yes, of course, it's for this wealthy businessman, and it's fantastic that they do what they do. But at community level, it's a totally different story. And if we are able to bridge these different layers, I think we're going to be very successful in introducing Bitcoin with all the dangers, not only mystifying Bitcoin, because I was in El Salvador and many women told me, no, I don't want to know anything about Bitcoin. I lost all my money because nobody told them that it could be devaluated, and nobody told them when to monitor, how to take the money out. I saw very sad cases in El Salvador that nobody's monitoring, by the way. But because I am in development, I knew in no time I could check what is going wrong. And so we have to be aware about that, because we might be very well intentioned, but it's not enough. And Bitcoin is a highly sophisticated model and a highly sophisticated opportunity that we have in hands. So we have to be very responsible about how we introduce Bitcoin to the population.
Yeah.
Is that enough, Greg? I'm sorry that I'm just
No, I love it. So how can people find out more about the work you're doing and the state of the Casa Bitcoin with you and your son? Or maybe
Well, to start with, this is an invitation for all of you to come to Yucatan, to stop in Merida, to see the ruins, Uxmal, Chichen Itza. You are very welcome to contact. My son is Daniel Robert, and I am approachable by this Telegram. I use the U26444 because it's how do you say, the symbol of the women is represented in that. And so you can use that. But yes, you can get in contact to us through Telegram. We have Yucatan Bitcoin, we have Casa Bitcoin, and it's in Telegram, all that. And but I think you have to come and be here to see with us. We can take you to see the community, to see these different layers of what we think is circular economy. Because we don't think you have to remain in one community or in one state. We think we have to give access to those communities, to a place where the Bitcoiners can come and meet them and buy their products, so that they are exposed to what Bitcoin is practically. And that, for us, it takes the layer of the peasants to the community, to the ranch that we're creating, all the way to the city where all the economic activities taking place. Sorry?
you said on Telegram at what? U26, what was it again?
2644.
One more time, U2644?
Yes, correct.
Okay, let me see. I'm going to see if I
check.
can. There we go. Look, I threw it up on the screen.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to reach out to Mercedes to see how you can participate, engage, visit if you're ever in Mexico, and just learn more about it, you can reach her on Telegram at U2644. And then please, let's do this again just to get an update, especially if I'll open the house and see the success. And then maybe me and you can try to put, if there's any posts you want me to post on my Twitter account or my X account, just to kind of get the word out and help y'all.
Yeah, well, sorry, it's sorry. The last one is 4040. I say double four is 40. That's Twitter. You put it in Twitter, yes. I cannot listen you anymore.
Okay, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So sorry. Yes, so sorry.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you, Greg. Thank you, and I'll be waiting for you to visit us with your 11 children here, and
fantastic.
tell your wife that she's the most welcome, and you can bring one or two, and maybe you can come all together. You will be the most welcome to our project.
Yeah, let's see if I can get them all down there.
Yes, I have actually one of our partners in this the Citadel is a Dutch guy who has 6 children, and they love it, and they have different ages, and they love to be in the countryside and planting all these things and see the avocados they have never seen grown. So all kind of for children, everything is magic. So if you come with them, they will teach us to discover the world. And the way they took all together, because as adults we only think in the economic terms, But I always rescue the children's perception, because they take us to the magic side, the spiritual side, all together, and economic as the means we have to survive, but not exclusively what we have to pay attention to. That's hard.
Okay, I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I missed you.
Sorry, I had a
Yes.
technical. Sometimes the internet.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that it took a longer. Maybe I thought, because I lost track on time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'll see if I
No,
can push
thank
more.
you. Thank you very much, Craig. And we
Yeah,
stay in touch. And I will be waiting for your visit.
fantastic. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Have a great
Stay
Sunday.
well. Have a lovely Sunday. Bye bye.
Bye bye. All right. So that was Mercedes over there doing some great work in Mexico. You can find a lot of her work on Telegram, or you can reach out to her on Telegram at U2640, and also on X, you can look her up. So another great Bitcoiner doing some fantastic work that I wanted to highlight. So again, I'm Craig LeBlanc, the Doorman, your host, and y'all have an awesome Sunday. Thanks a lot.